Ever heard of a bank robber using the Second Amendment, that whole right to bear arms thing, as his defense in court?
Not
Hey,
really.
it happened right in
Wow.
the middle of the Great Depression.
Oh,
A
wow.
guy named Jack Miller
Okay.
tried to justify his sawed-off shotgun, claimed it was his right.
So, did it work?
It's a long story.
Okay.
But that case, it really set the stage for how we debate gun control even today.
Interesting.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive
Huh.
into the Second Amendment. We're going to unpack how its interpretation has changed, over the years, look at the big court cases that shaped it.
Sounds fascinating.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's crucial if we want to understand this whole debate going on right now.
Okay, so where do we even begin with something this big?
I think the best place to start is at the beginning,
Makes sense.
back in 1791.
All right.
This is when the Second Amendment was first created.
Okay, so what was going on back then?
Well, it was a time of a lot of debate, a lot of tension, actually.
Yeah.
You had the Federalists on one side.
Right. Those were the guys who wanted a strong central government.
Yep.
And then you had the Anti-Federalists.
Right. They were more about states' rights.
Exactly.
So the Second Amendment is basically a compromise.
A compromise. Huh?
Yeah, they were trying to find some kind of middle ground.
Well, that explains why it's so open to interpretation.
Right. It's only 27 words long,
27 words.
but it's caused centuries of debate and legal battles.
That's amazing.
It is.
I mean, just thinking about it, it's like, wow, how can so few words cause so much controversy?
Well, that's the thing about the Constitution. It's meant to be this living document.
Right, it has to adapt to the times.
Exactly.
So going back to the Second Amendment, how did this compromise actually play out?
Well, if you look at the wording, it starts with a well-regulated militia. Right.
Mm.
That seems to suggest, at least to some people, that the amendment was mostly about states
Right.
having their own armed militias
Okay, I can see that.
as a way to kind of prevent the federal government from getting too powerful.
Makes sense, considering they had just fought a war for independence.
Right. I mean, the memory of British rule, it was still very fresh in their minds.
So having a way to defend themselves, that would have been a big deal.
Absolutely. So in that context, the Second Amendment could be seen as a way to protect against tyranny.
To ensure that states could push back if the federal government tried to overreach.
Exactly.
But then there's the other half of the amendment.
Right. The right of the people to keep and bear arms part.
Yeah, that sounds a lot more like an individual right.
And that's where things get complicated.
It's like, which is it? Is it for militias or for individuals?
And that ambiguity, that tension between the two interpretations, that's at the heart of so much of the gun control debate, even today.
So basically, from the get-go, there's this built-in uncertainty about what the amendment really means.
Exactly. It's fascinating, though, even back then, with all this debate, the right to bear arms wasn't absolute.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there were still restrictions,
Interesting.
especially for groups that were, well, I guess you could say seen as dangerous at the time.
Like who?
Well, there were laws that prevented Black Americans from owning guns.
Wow!
Native Americans, too.
Really?
Even Catholics in some places.
That's kind of surprising.
Yeah, it highlights something important.
What's that?
That gun control, in different forms, has been around since the very beginning of the United States.
So it's not this new thing, like some people might claim.
Exactly. It's been part of the conversation from the start.
Okay, so we've got this ambiguous amendment with restrictions already in place.
Right.
How does our bank robber friend, Jack Miller, fit into all of this?
Well, his case, back in the 1930s, it really brought the Second Amendment into a whole new legal arena.
Oh, so?
It all revolved around the National Firearms Act. Yep. That was a law passed to deal with gangster activity during Prohibition.
Oh, right, like Al Capone and all that.
Exactly.
So how did Jack Miller get mixed up in that?
He was caught with a sawed-off shotgun.
Ah, one of those weapons targeted by the NFA.
Precisely.
Mhm.
And he decided to use the Second Amendment as his defense.
He did.
Claimed the NFA violated his right to bear arms.
Bold move.
It was. His case ultimately failed.
But it raised some important questions about the amendment's meaning.
Right. It forced the courts to really start grappling with those individual gun ownership implications.
And it shows how, I guess, the times we live in can influence how we see the Second Amendment.
Exactly. The gangster era, it definitely played a role in how Miller's case was viewed.
Makes you wonder how current events will shape things going forward.
That is something to consider.
Yeah, things are definitely heating up around that time.
So then we move into the 1960s.
Right.
And it's a decade marked by a whole series of, well, I guess you could say national tragedies.
A lot of turmoil, for sure.
Yeah, we're talking about the assassinations of, President Kennedy,
Oh, yeah.
Malcolm X,
Mhm.
Martin Luther King Jr.
And of course, Robert Kennedy.
Exactly.
It was a really turbulent time, A lot of fear, a lot of anger.
It definitely had a huge impact on the national conversation around gun control.
It did.
And this is where we see the passage of the Gun Control Act of 1968.
Right, the second major federal gun law since that NFA we talked about earlier.
So what did this Gun Control Act actually do?
Well, for one thing, it banned interstate gun sales.
Like, you couldn't buy a gun in one state and then just bring it across state lines.
Exactly. You couldn't just, go to a state with looser laws and then bring the gun back home.
That makes sense, I guess, to try to prevent, guns from flowing into places with stricter laws.
Right, and it also prohibited certain groups from owning guns altogether.
What kind of groups?
Felons, for instance.
Okay, so people convicted of serious crimes.
Yeah, and also people with, a history of mental illness.
It seems like they were really trying to, address the issue from multiple angles.
They were definitely trying to find ways to reduce gun violence, in light of all those tragedies.
It makes sense, given the context of the time.
Right, it was a response to a very real and very pressing problem.
And this is also where we start to see a really interesting shift within the NRA.
Oh, yeah, the NRA.
The Gun Control Act of 1968, it seems like that was a real turning point for them.
It was. They went from being this, mostly sportsman's organization focused on things like hunting and marksmanship.
Right, to becoming a much more, well, I guess you could say politically active force.
Yeah, they really started to advocate for a much broader interpretation of the Second Amendment.
So they were basically pushing back against any attempts to regulate guns.
Pretty much. They started framing any kind of gun control as a threat to individual liberty, a slippery slope towards government tyranny.
But wasn't the NRA, at least initially, supportive of some gun control measures? I vaguely remember reading something about that.
You're right. In the 1930s, the NRA president actually testified in favor of stricter gun laws.
Wow, that's a pretty big contrast to their stance today.
It is. So what happened?
Well, a lot of things were changing in the country. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, societal anxieties were rising.
Crime was a big concern, for sure.
Right. And then there was the whole counterculture movement, a lot of social upheaval.
Yeah, it was a time of rapid change, and that definitely had an impact on the gun control debate.
And within the NRA itself, there was this growing tension between, the old guard, focused on responsible gun ownership, and a newer, more politically assertive faction.
Right. And this all culminated in what's known as the Cincinnati coup in 1977.
The Cincinnati coup, what was that all about?
Well, basically, the NRA was holding its annual meeting in Cincinnati that year. And this new faction, led by a guy named Harlan Carter.
Harlan Carter.
Yeah, they basically staged a takeover.
Really?
Yeah, they leveraged the organization's internal rules to basically kick out the old leadership and install themselves.
So it was like an internal power struggle.
Exactly. And it had a huge impact on the direction of the NRA.
So how did things change under this new leadership?
Well, under Carter, the NRA became much more focused on opposing any and all gun control measures, They really doubled down on that slippery slope argument, claiming that any form of gun control would inevitably lead to the government confiscating everyone's guns.
So even if public opinion was in favor of, some level of gun control, the NRA was just digging in its heels.
Pretty much. Their message was clear. No compromise on gun rights.
It's amazing how such a dramatic shift within an organization can have such a huge ripple effect on a national issue like gun control.
It really shows how intertwined everything is. Social movements, legal interpretations, political power. You can't really understand one without the others.
So we got the NRA becoming this powerful political force.
Right.
But the movement for gun control, that wasn't exactly going away either, was it?
Definitely not. And then in 1981, you have the attempted assassination of President Reagan.
That must have been another huge turning point in this whole debate.
It was. And the fact that his press secretary, James Brady, was severely injured in the shooting, that really galvanized the gun control movement.
Right. The Bradys became really outspoken advocates for stricter gun laws.
They did. And they focused a lot of their efforts on handguns, because those were the weapons most commonly used in gun crimes.
And this is what led to the Brady Act in 1994.
Exactly.
The one that mandated background checks for gun purchases.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that initially, even some NRA members supported it.
Really?
Yeah, there was a sense of urgency after the Reagan shooting, Something needed to be done.
So there was some common ground, at least for a little while.
There was. But as the debate over the Brady Act dragged on, the NRA's rhetoric started to shift again.
How so?
They started to frame any kind of gun control, even background checks, as this slippery slope that would eventually lead to, the government taking away everyone's guns.
So even though public opinion seemed to be moving towards more gun control, the NRA was doubling down on its opposition.
Yep. And that hardline stance, it really started to dominate the public conversation about gun control.
It's interesting how, even within groups that seem like they all agree, there can be these internal divisions and shifts in thinking.
Absolutely. But in the end, the NRA's increasingly strong stance against any form of gun control, that became their defining message.
Okay, so things are heating up on the political front, but then we get to 2008, and this landmark Supreme Court case, District of Columbia v. Heller.
Right, Heller, this was a big one.
This was the first time the Supreme Court really weighed in on the individual right to own a gun, right?
Exactly. It was a game changer.
So what happened in Heller?
The case was about a law in Washington, D.C. that basically banned handgun ownership in the home.
Wow, that's pretty restrictive.
It was,
Yeah.
and the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, ruled that this law violated the Second Amendment.
So they were saying that individuals do have a right to own a handgun, at least for self-defense in their own homes.
That's right. It was a major victory for gun rights advocates.
But didn't the court also say that the Second Amendment isn't absolute? Like, there's still room for some regulation?
You're right. The court acknowledged that the government could still regulate firearms.
So it wasn't a complete win for gun rights advocates.
Not exactly. The court said that any regulations had to be consistent with the core purpose of the Second Amendment, which they saw as self-defense.
Okay, so it's like this delicate balancing act.
Exactly. It's about finding that middle ground between individual rights and the government's responsibility to keep people safe.
So Heller kind of set the stage for future battles over gun control.
It did. It raised a whole bunch of questions about where to draw the line between permissible regulation and infringement on Second Amendment rights.
Right, because if the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun, but that right isn't unlimited, where do you draw the line?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's exactly what the courts have been grappling with ever since Heller.
And that brings us to the most recent major Supreme Court case. New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruen in 2022.
Bruen, yeah, that one really shook things up.
So what was different about Bruen?
Well, Bruen was about a New York law that restricted concealed carry permits.
So it wasn't about owning a gun in your home, but about carrying one in public.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, again, in a 5-4 decision, struck down that New York law.
They said it violated the Second Amendment.
Right. But what makes Bruen really significant is the test they established for evaluating gun laws.
A test.
Yeah. They said that modern gun laws, to be considered constitutional, have to be consistent with historical regulations from the 1700s and 1800s.
Wait, so we're supposed to look back at laws from the time of muskets to decide if a modern law regulating, like AR-15s, is constitutional.
That's essentially what the court is saying.
But doesn't that seem a little, impractical?
That's what a lot of legal scholars and gun control advocates are saying.
I mean, how can you compare laws written when the most advanced weapon was a single-shot musket to the challenges we face with modern firearms technology?
It's a valid point. The Founding Fathers couldn't have envisioned the kinds of weapons we have today.
Or the scale of gun violence we're dealing with.
Exactly. So trying to fit 21st century problems into an 18th century legal framework, well, it gets complicated.
So does this mean we're basically stuck in some kind of legal time warp when it comes to gun control?
Well, that's the big question, and that's what's at stake in this upcoming Supreme Court case. United States v. Rahim.
Rahim. This is the first I'm hearing of this one.
It's a case that could really clarify how this whole historical test thing should actually be applied.
And its outcome could have major implications for gun control across the country.
Absolutely.
Okay, so tell me more about this Rahim case. What's it all about, and why is it so important?
It's a fascinating case, really. It centers around this guy, Zakir Rahim. He was under a domestic violence restraining order.
Oh, so he wasn't allowed to have guns.
Exactly. But then, later on, he was found with a firearm.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, led to his arrest, and, well, that's when he decided to challenge that law.
The one that says people with restraining orders can't own guns.
Right.
So he's basically saying that law is unconstitutional.
Yeah, And his argument hinges on that historical test that came out of the Bruen case.
The one that says gun laws today have to be consistent with historical regulations.
Exactly. His lawyers are saying there's no historical precedent for taking guns away from people in similar situations back in 1700s or 1800s.
But didn't we talk about how certain groups were disarmed throughout history? Like, I specifically remember the laws against Black Americans and Native Americans owning guns.
You're right, those laws did exist.
Wouldn't those be considered, I don't know, kind of historical precedent?
That's the big debate in this case. On one hand, you have those examples of disarming certain groups,
Right.
but the problem is those laws were rooted in discrimination and prejudice.
Yeah. Definitely not something we want to repeat.
Exactly. So the question becomes, can you use those examples to justify laws today that are designed to protect people?
It's a tricky situation for sure.
It is, and that's why this Rahim case is so important. It forces us to look at this question of historical context and, well, how to interpret it fairly.
Because it feels dangerous to use discriminatory practices from the past to, I don't know, justify actions in the present,
Exactly.
especially when we're talking about something as serious as gun ownership.
Right. It's a tough ethical question, and the Rahim case, it really brings all these issues to the forefront.
So what could actually happen?
What are the possible outcomes?
Yeah, and what if the Supreme Court sides with Rahim?
Well, if they rule in his favor, it could make it a lot harder to pass any new gun control laws.
Even laws meant to, protect people.
It could have a ripple effect, yeah.
So it's not just about restraining orders, it's about a whole range of things.
Right. It could impact laws about, well, all sorts of situations where we try to keep guns out of the wrong hands.
That's a little concerning.
It is a big concern for a lot of people.
It feels like it could create a loophole that puts people at risk.
That's what gun control advocates are worried about.
Yeah, it could make it almost impossible to regulate firearms effectively.
Right. Even in situations where it seems pretty clear, that someone shouldn't have access to a gun,
But what happens if the court rules against Rahim?
if they side with the government.
Yeah, what would that mean for the future of gun regulation?
Well, it would probably mean those kinds of laws would remain in place.
Like the one he was challenging.
Yeah, so the government could keep regulating firearms in situations like domestic violence.
Okay, so it kind of maintains the status quo.
In a way, yeah. It would mean the historical test from Bruen isn't an absolute roadblock to enacting gun control measures.
So the government could still act to keep people safe, even if there's no direct historical comparison.
Right, it wouldn't be a complete free-for-all when it comes to guns.
This Rahim case, it feels like it has the potential to really shift things one way or the other.
It does. It's a pivotal moment for sure.
It really makes you think. How will the court balance these historical arguments with the realities of gun violence today?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a reminder that interpreting constitutional rights, it's not some fixed thing. It changes over time.
Right, it's influenced by social changes, new technology, political events.
Exactly. And the Rahim case is a perfect example of that process playing out in real time.
It's been quite a journey, this deep dive.
It has.
We've covered a lot of ground, the history, the NRA, the court cases, and now this Rahim case.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
It is, but it's also incredibly important.
Definitely. The Second Amendment, it continues to be at the center of a lot of debate.
And the Rahim case.
Well, that could have a lasting impact on how we understand and interpret it.
Before we go, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
With all the legal back and forth, it's easy to forget that at the heart of this debate, there are people.
People.
Yeah, real people whose lives are impacted by gun violence every single day.
It's a good reminder. It can be easy to get lost in the abstract arguments.
It can. But behind the statistics, there are families, communities, individuals who are dealing with the consequences of gun violence.
So as we continue to have this conversation, we need to remember that human element.
We do. It's about more than just laws and rights. It's about creating a society where everyone can feel safe.
Well said. The Second Amendment, it's a complex issue, but it's one we need to keep talking about.
Absolutely. And the Rahim case.
It's just the latest chapter in this ongoing story.
A story that we're all a part of.
And that's why it's so important for all of us to stay informed, engaged, and ready to participate in this crucial conversation. Thanks for joining us today on this deep dive into the Second Amendment.